Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Abram Kielsmeyer-Jones, and this is Translation Notes, our ongoing series where we look at the lexical and grammatical questions that arise when we translate from Greek into English. And in particular, we're doing that with the Gospel of Mark. I note, as always, that the focus of this series is more on the Greek text and translation per se than it is on accordance features. If you are interested in learning more about particular accordance features, the help menu has lots and lots of sources of support. You are able to access pre-recorded webinars here, and then even this top file if you prefer something written out. That's an extensive set of documentation on the app. So if you're looking for something feature specific, you can go there. Of course, uh, we will use different features today in accordance, but all in the service of translation. Last time we looked at Mark 15:33 through 36, and this time we'll look at Mark 15:37 through 41, just to take a look at where we are. And I'll just open up a parallel English pane here. We are at the death of Jesus. And there's been some lead up to it with his trial and even the setup, what was happening at the cross. And so today, in today's session, we're in the verse where he actually dies. That's verse 37, Mark 15:37. And we'll see that after this, we move into the burial and then the resurrection. So we're getting close to the end of the book. The story, of course, does not end here, but it sounds, in a narrative sense, it sounds very much like an ending because, in fact, it is an ending. He breathes his last. Let's begin with just checking in and make sure folks are able to access everything. This handout that you see at left here is available to you in the materials section of your go-to webinar control panel. If you're not showing materials, just make sure you can go to the three horizontal dots. That's the More menu. But materials has a piece of paper icon and a paper clip, and you can access the handout that way. For this particular series, I've also uploaded this handout and all the other ones at tinyurl.com/Mark Translation Notes. That's a shortcut to a shared Google Drive folder where you can access this and all the other handouts. You can also email me at abramkj@accordancebible.com. Finally, there's a questions box where you can type any questions or comments that you've got. That's like a one-way typed chat. I'll either respond individually or I may share your comment anonymously with the group. So feel free to communicate there. I will stop from time to time and check in on questions. All right, without further ado, let's get to the text. Here's the review of last time, and I'm going to just make this a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. So last time, then when it was the 6th hour, noon, darkness came over all the earth until the 9th hour, 3 in the afternoon. And we talked about how this is a particular translation decision, whether you do it how the Greek has it, or if you translate not just the words, but also the time-telling convention. I put both options there, but we talked through that last time. So it was the 6th hour or noon, darkness over all the earth for 3 hours. And at the 9th hour, 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And hearing him, some of the bystanders said, Behold, he is calling Elijah. Then someone, after running and filling a sponge with sour wine and putting it on a staff, gave it to him to drink, saying, Leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down. So we stopped there. If you didn't know the story, it might be a little bit of a cliffhanger. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down. But in fact, Elijah does not come to take him down. There are larger goals, purposes at play here. We come to verse 37. I'm going to put this back here on the side, and we'll look at this in accordance. I've also got my translation here. But let's go left to right. Hade Jesus aphes phonein megalen ezepnusin. Ezepnusin. get that accent there over the epsilon. Left to right, we've got this what's called a post-positive de. So it looks like it's splitting up the ha Jesus, but that's just because of its position in the sentence. So this goes first, and or but Jesus letting go or releasing voice, great voice, loud voice, breathed his last or expired. Let's look at this particular verse in more detail. I have translated that day as contrastive, so that's but. It could be and. I think but here makes the most sense because it is in contrast to maybe Elijah will come. Let's see if Elijah comes and takes him down, but Elijah was not coming to take him down. But instead is the idea. So that's a contrastive there. But Jesus, shouting in a loud voice, breathed his last. We've got this aphes, phonein megalin. That's a participle, and that modifies this main verb, zepnusin. And so if you were doing a more wooden translation, it would be something like this. Jesus, shouting in a loud voice, breathed his last. Or you could say after shouting, or while shouting in a loud voice, or figure out what the relationship is, the participle to the main verb. You could also just translate it as two indicative verbs, but Jesus shouted in a loud voice and breathed his last. This aphes is interesting. It comes from aphiemi, which we may know that from our vocabulary or initial learning as let go or release, or even it can be used in the context of forgiveness. Here, it has to do with giving up or emitting. So there's this, you can think about an involuntary sigh, perhaps, as Jesus is letting out, is what Max and Mary say. He's letting out a loud voice or a sound. We'll come back to that on phonein, but he's letting it out. Aphes has that sense of not necessarily pushing it out, but letting it out. And that makes sense with this breathed his last verb, of course, because his agency is rapidly diminishing because this is it. This is the end. So that groan, there's maybe some degree of volition, but he's breathing his last. And so I think aphiemi makes sense there. Now, how you do that in translation, I'm not sure. I think shouting in a loud voice is just fine. But you might consider, do you want to seize on that nuance there of giving up or emitting, letting out, as Max and Mary said? You want to bring that out in translation, because I don't get the sense that this is, I mean, Jesus is shouting, it's very loud. We've got phonein, megalein, but it's almost like this, kind of unified event. In fact, you may even consider in translation that this loud shout and this breathing the last, you might even consider how they work together and have an intensifying effect. So you understand the participle, let go of a loud shout, which doesn't really make sense in English, but I'm just putting that there as a gloss. And then the main verb, exhaled for the last time, you might just think about, are there ways I can translate that even with one verb that encompasses this whole, what feels like this continued action of shouting / breathing one's last, if that makes sense. And there probably are any number of ways to do that. I would also use an opportunity, I would take an opportunity to look at what other verses have here. I just selected live click and made sure that I had my verse lookup selected. So we've got uttered a loud voice, let out a loud cry. That's good. I think that does a good job of bringing over that nuance of letting go. So he let out a loud cry. Maybe that's the way to go. Even here, though, we have just one verb, and with a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. So it can always be worth looking at different translations and see how they do it. But there is something, I think, to decide there how you want to render that. Another decision is, how do we translate phonein? If I look at that word in a lexicon, and I'm just triple clicking to see it in BDAG, you've got a reference that appears here. So BDAG lists it under to call, cry, outcry, loud or solemn declaration, and so this is under voice. It can also mean noise. Does it matter immensely for translation whether this is Jesus letting out a loud voice or a loud sound? I don't think it does, because what else would he be letting out sound wise, other as he breathes his last, other than his voice? So that, I think, is not super consequential for translation. You do need to choose a word, voice or sound. Um, what I note for sure, though, is that Mark doesn't give us this shout or this loud noise or this groan, or whatever you want to translate it as. He doesn't give it to us as recorded words per se. So you can translate it as voice, but Mark at least isn't explicitly telling us voice in the sense of, and here were the words he said. We just don't get that. This sounds like a wordless thing. Now, it's not impossible in theory, and we want to compare with other gospels, but it's not impossible that Jesus could have said words with this final loud voice. Mark doesn't give us those. So the image from Mark is just this loud sound. So whether that means voice or sound in translation is one of these little decisions to make in translation, but we just want to think through it a little bit. We have an interesting word here, exepnusin, breathe out one's life or soul, expire. BDAG tells us it's a euphemism for die. We will see this verb again in verse 39. The question is, how do we translate it? I'm just going to go back to accordance and triple click it. So here's BDAG. This, of course, is Bauer, Donker, Arndt Gingrich's Greek English Lexicon of the New Testament and other, other classical Greek literature. This is a pretty good, early Christian literature. This is a pretty good standard for Greek lexicons. So they just have breathe out one's life or soul or expire, and it's a euphemism for die. As with any euphemism, or this is true of idioms too. So if there's a phrase that we, a certain way of saying something, we want to consider, do we keep it as a euphemism, or do we translate what the euphemism is euphemizing? And your approach to translation and readability and what level of poetics you want, all of that is what will impact that decision. So that's all to say, you could translate this, Jesus died. You could also translate it as Jesus breathed his last. I don't know that you would translate it as Jesus expired, even though we get that as a translation equivalent here in BDAG. That might be older English. Again, I'll just look at different translations and see what they have here. Common English Bible just gives us died. We get breathed his last. We get gave up the ghost, which that's the Authorized Standard Version. I'm not sure I would do that. That's taking a euphemism, King James here. It's taking a euphemism and giving us an idiom for it, which, you can do it. Gave up the ghost is a euphemism. It's sort of like some people think it's a nicer way of saying die. Personally, I think die, everybody dies. So as long as we're talking about it sensitively, I don't see why not just say die. But sometimes people might be uncomfortable, so passed away. All that's to say, this is one of those euphemisms. So your decision is, do I keep some kind of euphemism that doesn't say die in my translation, or do I just say he died? And you can see the wide variety here. Breathed his last, gave up the ghost, took his last breath, died. Breathed his last is good in the sense that it preserves the meaning of this word. It does have that kind of euphemistic quality, and it's pretty like biologically specific. So there's no real question. If you were not a native English speaker in the time that the King James were published, you may not know what gave up the ghost means. That has nothing to do, those words by themselves have nothing to do with dying. So that might be confusing. But breathe one's last is pretty clear. This is the kind of thing that I often will turn to the UBS Bible translators handbooks for, because they'll often have notes along these lines. Let me just scroll up to verse 37 here. Breathed his last, it says, is a good idiomatic equivalent of the Greek, but it is not literally translatable into many languages. He died is a more frequent parallel. Well, it is quite translatable into English, and so we leave it there. But if you were going into another language, of course, you'd want to think about that. Let's pause there and see what comments or questions you've got on that verse. And here's a comment. I'll put this in the chat so folks can see what I'm responding to. Somebody says Mark 15, 34 and 37 should be translated consistently as a loud voice. Yeah, which contains other words in the Gospels. That's right. So when we compare this to other Gospels, and if there are words on Jesus's lips with this breathing out, we consider that just in general as we're trying to piece together the last words of Christ. But yeah, so back to, let me just check. Let's see if I did that consistently. Verse 34, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, in the verb that we had there. Yeah, so here he's boao in a loud voice. So that is a different, so that part is different. So you have phone megale, so it's that same loud voice or great sound, whatever you translate it as. It's those same two words, but it's a different verb. And so that could lend support to what I was saying about this being a more almost passive, involuntary kind of shouting out. But yeah, that's worth considering. Now here, of course, in verse 34 with the phone megale, we get the content of that. So you could consider a consistent translation. You could also consider whether this verb and the lack of words mean that you want a different translation here. That's something for you as a translator to decide. But to the point of the comment, the argument for consistency is that this verse 37, there are words associated with his last breath in other Gospels. And I'll just leave that there. I know there's so much there to explore with the gospel parallels. You could just open up one of those tools, and actually the easier way is go to Add Parallel Info pane, and you'll get the parallel accounts up at the top, and you can get right into your gospel parallels there and see how the other gospel writers describe this. But yeah, great comment, and just interesting to see loud voice, different verb this time. And then again, the important part, well, it's all important, but this as zepnusin, I mean, that's it. That's the end. So I would definitely start a new paragraph. Well, I don't know. Maybe I definitely wouldn't because there's this chi, but it seems like this could be a good end of a paragraph because that's the end of Jesus's life, at least at this point. But it's connected to what happens in verse 38. So it's almost as if, Mark doesn't explicitly say this, but this chi connects it. So as Jesus breathes his last, or immediately after, we see this curtain of the temple torn in two. We'll turn to that next. Let me just check in and make sure we are good on questions, comments. Feel free at any time to put them in. Let me move on to verse 38. Make my screen a little bit easier. All right, here we go. Kai ta kata petas ma tu nau, esquiste es duo ab anothen heos kato. And the curtain of the temple was torn or was split in or into two. You can imagine a comma there from above or from the top to or until the bottom. So a little smoother translation would be, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And that's how I translated it. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. I'm not going to go through all of the notes that are here, but I wanted you to have these because there is some question of interpretation of which of two curtains are in view here. And this is just from BDAG. It says in the temple at Jerusalem, one curtain separated the Holy of Holies from the holy place, and another covered the entrance from the forecourt to the temple proper. And what I really appreciate about this, and this will be hyperlinked in your BDAG, is that it talks about how the same word can refer to either curtain, and it gives you all the context. So context, even other contexts, won't determine what it means here. It's not like you can see this is curtain, there were multiple curtains, this only referred to the one. Well, it can refer to the both. But then it goes on to say our literature, so what's surveyed in the lexicon, knows only the inner curtain. And then here's another note. The New English Translation Bible just talks about how this is not entirely clear. Other commentators will say it is clear, and it lists which curtain is meant. But I put this in bold. Well, two things I'll say. Number one, for translation, I don't think you need to say which curtain, because this katapetasma is curtain. I mean, if you really want to get precise, and if you're sure which curtain, and if that seems important to you as Mark is writing, you could say the inner curtain or something like that. But I think in translation, the curtain of the temple is the way to go. So I don't think you would have to come to a conclusion here before translating it. And regardless of how you read this, and this is just kind of offering a springboard for future research and not doing any of it right now, but I appreciate this note that I put in bold from the New English Translation Bible. It says, either way, regardless of which curtain, the symbolism means that access to God has been opened up. And in fact, and now of course that's an interpretation, but not just opened up, but there's something too about this verb, this being split or torn apart. There's a certain decisiveness to that, I think. And you might even see how this is used in other contexts, just to confirm that. Where else is it used? You've got 11 times in the Greek New Testament, so you could look at that and see where that's used. But in some cases, and in fact, BDAG locates our verse here, divide by the use of force. So if you follow the New English Translation note that this has to do with the symbolism of access to God, I think you could also interpret this as saying, uh, almost like without question, or there is this emphatic splitting of the curtain. There is this emphatic removing of what might have separated a person from access to God in the past. Again, that's all interpretation. And Mark does not explicitly say that. So in translation, we bring it out this way. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. It may be that somebody reading this, whether it's you a couple months from now or somebody that you're preparing this for, may have no sense of what this means. So it probably requires explanation somewhere, if in fact it is symbolic, which I think it is. And so in translation, you don't have to do a whole lot, but interpretation, it's worth just looking at this and thinking about how this might represent access to God. And of course, you get into Hebrews and all of that. But I think with interpretation, we both want to stick with Mark, not go beyond what he's trying to say, but also realize that sometimes he would say things that, maybe in the first century, this would just be understood what this meant. So that's the work of interpretation, is bridging the divide of time and space to really make sure we're getting what Mark is saying. So I appreciate this note, and I put that there. And then again, just if this is in fact emphatic, you get this not just torn into two, but from top to bottom. Kind of think about the phrase from Alpha to Omega, from A to Z, all the way. Again, there's no question. It's not just like a little, a small hole that someone can kind of barely peer through. I mean, this is like all the way split top to bottom. So I think in that interpretation of this being symbolic, there's just even more emphasis there. So that's verse 38. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. What questions or comments do you have before we move on to what's next? I'll look at the chat. All right, let me put this in the chat and then respond to it. Somebody says Mark 15:1 through 15:41 all tightly involve the local cross events except verse 38. That is a really good point. Yeah, this does relocate us, right? So the complete change of location is significant in an explanatory fact by the author. That's a great point. And that goes back to, often we can ask, what is Mark doing right now? Yes, we want to translate, but what is this verse doing here? It's always good to ask that. And it is relocating us. And so that is at least saying, however you interpret the symbolism of this, at least this verse is saying what happened here had impact over here. And yeah, that's a great point, that we have been so closely linked location wise to this one spot, and now we're not. That ought to stand out to us. So yeah, thank you for that. That's a great thought. We see another question. I'll put this in the chat. Somebody says, give me just a moment. Wear and tear from use, would have expected the bottom to have more wear as top supported by rings holding it on the rod. Yeah, good point. Yeah, like people, lifting it up from the bottom and not from the top. That goes with another comment here, but not bottom to top. God reached down and tore it. Yeah, interesting thought. Yeah, right. I mean, if you think about how I think if I hear the comment, how the curtain was already worn, like if a human were ripping it, it would be easier to rip from the bottom where you already have a start. So yeah, it could be that Mark is meaning that to show some kind of divine intervention. That's a great point. I mean, that's how I interpret it. I'm just holding that loosely in the act of translation. But yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Great comments. Keep them coming, and let's move on. Yeah, and I regret moving on so quickly because I think this is just there's so much potential theological import here. So we'll move on because we've translated it, and that's what we're after here. But this would be a verse very much worth tarrying with. I mean, you've got all these hyperlinked verses in BDAG if you've got it, or the New English Translation Bible. And then also just looking at any commentary you have, seeing what they say. You're going to get no shortage of attention paid to this. I mean, this is an often analyzed verse. I don't know of any commentary that just takes this as a description of what happened and moves on. I mean, I think any commentary is going to say there's some significance and here's what it is. So very much worth further study. All right, so now we're back at the cross in verse 39. And we've got idon de ha centurion ha paristikos ex enantias autou hatihutos ezepnusin epen alethos hutas ha anthropos huias theou ein. And we're just going to go left to right at first, which is going to be awkward, and we'll work on word order in a minute. But we've got seeing now the centurion who was standing or who had been standing opposite him or in front of him, seeing that, thus he breathed his last, same word as in 37. He said, truly, or in truth, truly, we want the adverb there, this man, the Son of God, was. Here's how I translated it. Now, when the centurion, the one standing in front of him, saw how he breathed his last, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. Again, we've just got back-to-back super powerful verses that really, I think, deserve far more time than we're going to give them today. Let's talk about word order first, though, because it is a little, I mean, you've got this idon as a participle, and so we would expect typically to see a main verb, which doesn't come until all the way over here. If I were to open the diagrams, which I will do right now, this is add parallel diagram, Greek New Testament, you will see here that we've got this idon, and that as a verbal participle, it's modifying apen. So in seeing this, he said, but there's a lot of intervening material between the participle and the verb. We just can't do that in English. Our language just doesn't work that way, which is why, maybe you start left to right, but ultimately you're going to have to think about word order. So this is the relationship, that this is like the setup or the modifying, like seeing how Jesus breathed his last, he said. And so And then we also have this, the one standing in front of him. So where does that go? So this is, I've tried to do word order that makes the most sense in English. I always want to follow the word order of Greek as much as possible. Like I said, sometimes you just can't. So I've given it this way. Now, when the centurion, the one standing in front of him, and then the saw goes over here, saw how he breathed his last, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. So we just can't front the Edon like the Greek does. Now, is there significance to that Mark is fronting that? There could be, there doesn't have to be. But there's certainly a significance to what this guy says. But before we talk about what he said, let's talk about who he was. Commentaries and study Bibles, any of them, will have more on what a centurion was. And you see here, this is, our centurion is not very different from the Greek word itself. The translation decision to make is, do you assume that your readers won't know what a centurion means and you don't want them to have to look it up? If that's your approach, which it doesn't have to be, but if that's your approach, you would maybe choose something like lead soldier, pardon the typo there, or even army commander of 100 would be a really good translation in terms of actually explaining what this word is. Now, whether you think that fits in your final translation or not is up to you. But in BDAG, we get just centurion. But if we were to start to look at study Bibles or even just the New England translation notes, here we get some information, and your commentaries can give you more about how the armies were organized. I mean, you could spend a whole afternoon on the structure of the Roman army, but we get here that this is commanding a centuria of nominally 100 men. So there could be 105, there could be 120, there could be 90, but it's about 100 men, and that's the size. And so you've got the responsibilities here, and again, you could spend a lot more time researching this, but the foundational question, I think, is, do we bring this word over as centurion and just know that somewhere that's going to get explained, whether it's in conversation or if we do a study note or in our own notes, or do we translate centurion into words that make more sense for someone who may not know what that is? And that decision just is left with the translator. Most translations will give you centurion. Some of the more dynamic translations, maybe ones that might even be more open to paraphrase, might, like, here's the New International Reader's Version. So this is the NIV pitched at a younger reading level, and that says a Roman commander. So the idea there is that someone may not know what a centurion is, but they may know what a commander is. And Roman's just where he is. New Living Translation too, we might expect this, Roman officer. And then it tells you in the footnote, Greek, the centurion. You'll see a lot of the centurion, captain. So that's for you to decide, and this all comes down to not what this word means, because this word means one thing. I mean, it's just kind of easy in that sense. This is a title, and we can research what the particular job responsibilities were. The question is, what do you do in translation? And that just has to do with your philosophy of translation. Now to the really big point of this verse, in my opinion. Surely this man was the Son of God, huios theou ein. And if huiou theou or huios theou sounds familiar, it should, because, well, it's not like it's been repeated throughout the book, but we can search for the lexeme, which is going to give us huios theos, however it's inflected. And surely enough, here in Mark 1:1, we've got, this is in the genitive, this is in the nominative, but it's the same phrase, the Son of God. It's genitive here because this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And here it's in the nominative because it's the subject of this word, but it is the same Son of God. These are the only two times in Mark that this phrase is used. This is something that you may want to consider caution in building too much of a case on this, only because of huiou theou being potentially a textual variant, but it's made it into the surface text of DNA 28. So even if there's some question there, it's not in every manuscript. The editors put it there on the surface text. This, I think, serves as bookends to Mark's gospel, and I'm far from the first one to have pointed this out. It was on the lips of Mark the evangelist at first, but now it's on the lips of a centurion. And in the beginning, Mark 1:1, you had RK, and now you've got Ezepnusin at the end, breathing his last. So from the beginning to the end, we have this Son of God bookmarking both the beginning and the end. Whether the centurion knew that he was playing this part in Mark's narrative is another question. Even beyond that, it's interesting to look at commentaries, which even just a brief glance, you'll see there's a question of interpretation. In what sense did he mean this? Now, it is possible, in theory at least, that he's being sarcastic, like King of the Jews, and we've seen so much of that already. I don't think that's the case because of this alethos, unless he's saying that sarcastically, but that word has the ring of like sincerity. So again, yeah, sure, it's possible he's being sarcastic, but this alethos makes me think otherwise. So then there's still the question of, does he think of God's son like lowercase s, like, and even God lowercase g, like he's some kind of divine person, but not this specific Jesus Christ, the Son of God? Or is he saying Son of God in the way that Mark meant it? Now, that is a question of interpretation, but it does also affect your translation. Namely, do you capitalize your S and your G? Surely this man was the Son of God, with capital S and capital G, or not capital S, capital G. I would spend some time on this in the commentaries. I'm just very briefly highlighting the fact that this issue exists and that it's worth looking at. I'm going to go to the SIL Exegetical Summary Series because it has, or at least I thought it did, maybe it's the UBS commentary series. I saw a good summary note on this, the UBS Translators Handbook. Here we go. This man was the Son, and then lowercase of God. Commentators and translators are divided over whether the words are to be taken as an expression of awe and admiration on the part of a pagan, a son of God. So you still have capital G, but lowercase s, meaning a hero, a superhuman being, or whether they are to be understood in a Christian sense as the Son of God. And then it lists some different commentaries there. This would be worth exploring. In Mark's narrative, I think it serves the function of identifying Jesus as capital S, Son of God, whether the centurion knows it or not. But again, what you decide in interpretation will affect your translation. Should Son be capitalized or not? And it's amazing how some translation just goes very quickly and very smoothly, and others, like whether to capitalize a letter or not, could actually take a decent amount of research. Like, what would a Roman centurion have believed? Who was this centurion? Is he mentioned in the other Gospels? What could he have known about Jesus? And looking through your commentary, so there's a lot to do there just to figure out if this gets capitalized or not. But to me, I think apart from what the centurion knew or didn't know, Mark knew that this was the Son of God, and I think Mark now has moved away from the sarcastic titles, and with this alethos, I think Mark, regardless of where the centurion's at, I think Mark is giving us Jesus with his true title as Son of God. Again, that's an interpretation. I think that argument is weakened by the fact that this phrase does not occur more than twice in Mark, but we do have Son of Man quite often, which has similar meaning. So just something to consider. But you'll see a lot of commentaries that will point out how this is bookends, even though the book's not done, but we are getting close to the end. All right, I would love to hear from you. I know we kind of moved into the world of interpretation a little bit, but again, we got to do some to figure out, is this S capitalized or not? Let's see what comments or questions you have. I'll leave this verse up on the screen as I go to questions. Oh, interesting. Yeah, here's, this is great. Let me put this in the chat. Somebody says the way Jesus breathed his last. And so that's hutos, how he breathed his last, or thus breathed his last, was so extraordinary that the centurion could only conclude spiritual thought. So maybe verse 37, in ordinary Jesus died, seems to be missing something when using two verbs for translation. Yeah, great comment. Let's see what else we've got here. I saw a couple come in. Yeah, here, I'll just put this. Somebody says, who is a centurion? Nope, I put that in the wrong spot. Sorry. John Wayne, if Hollywood gets a vote. Yeah. Yeah, I would like to know more about this character. I think in the end, whatever we conclude, whoever would play him in a Hollywood rendition, I think he is serving a specific purpose in Mark's narrative. I think it is true that he was there and Mark is recording the narrative as a narrative. And I think he's playing an important part. Mark often does that. Let me just check in with questions. And thank you for your patience. I'm still trying to navigate this new layout and find all the questions and put them in the right place. Oh, here's a comment on, yeah, so, right. Let me put this in the chat. This is back to Mark 1:1. Somebody says UBS note on Mark 1:1 as a C, doubtful phrase. Yeah, and I think there's some text criticism that goes into that, figuring out if you think that is part of the text or not, which is why I kind of offer that interpretation and hold it loosely as I do, that acknowledging that you're building a theology around the Son of God around two verses, one of which has a textual variant. So I think just acknowledging that is important because, yeah, you may not see. I mean, to see as a doubtful phrase, that's enough confidence to put it in the surface text, but not enough confidence to not put it in brackets. All right, one more comment. Oh yeah, this is interesting. I'll just put this in the chat and read it. And I think I got all the questions. If I missed yours, please feel free to just type it again if you don't mind. But here's a comment, verse 39, alethos hutas ha anthropos huios theou. And this is an anarthrous phrase, emphasizes the character, nature, quality. Huios theou, better translated offspring of deity, not the son of the God. And then some plural examples there. Yeah, this, again, what we didn't do, but would be worth doing is looking at this phrase in all of its other uses and seeing what level of, what's the semantic range of this phrase. Does this phrase in the New Testament even ever permit the possibility of a S lowercase son of God or son of the deity? And someone gave some examples there in the chat. So thanks for that. Okay, cultural reference here. I'll put this in the chat and then we'll move on. John Wayne plays the centurion in the movie The Greatest Story Ever Told. All right, so that was not hypothetical. Did not realize that. All right, thank you for that. Let's move to verse 40. Again, regretting moving on from such a powerful verse, but there's always further study. All right, so verse 40 and 41 are a long sentence, and I have preserved them as a long sentence, which in the end I might not do, but I did just for the sake of, again, if I'm going to err on any side, at least for these webinars, I want to err on the side of sticking as close to the Greek as possible, just so we can see what the Greek says, and then in translation, we make whatever decisions. But so I've kept this as one verse. That's admittedly clunky, but let's go through verse 40 first. Esan de kai gunaikes apo makrathen theorusai en heis kai Maria he Magdalene kai Maria he Jacobu tumikru kai Yosetas meter kai Salome. And then we got to keep going, verse 41, but we're just going to stop there. Now there were also women from far off. And then we have theorusai. So this is going with this ason. So it's a periphrastic participle. So those go together. Again, this is where English and Greek just differ. You can't split that up like that in English. Let me just open the diagram because this is easier to visualize. So there it is. this goes together like this. The diagrams give you not word order, but logical Greek, or I'm sorry, logical English order. All right, so there were women, and we've got theoreo, who were watching or observing or noticing from afar, um, among whom, so we've got the relative pronoun, heis, uh, also Mary Magdalene and Mary. Now, this is tricky to go left to right, but we get Mary, the of James the Lesser and Joseph's mother, and Salome. You just cannot go left to right. An interlinear will be useful for finding out the individual words, but not for translation. Let's look at translation. And there were also women watching from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the Younger, and Joseph, and Salome. A couple notes here before we dive in. The were is not explicitly here, so we need to supply that. It's a verbless clause, but I think we want that in English. So there are three women in this verse: Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Younger, and Joseph, and Salome. Those are the three. Now, even as I look at this, there's a lot of names here, and I tried to distinguish who goes with whom. And I've done that with commas, but some translations even will make it a little clearer. And Mary, the mother of James the Younger and of Joseph. And that's, of course, permitted because this is all genitive. So that may make this a little more readable. But that's the idea. There are women watching from a distance, among whom were these three. This phrase, this last one here before we get to Salome, the diagrams are helpful for that, because if you're struggling to make sense of it, you'll see the diagrams putting it in an order that makes sense. So we would say Mary, the mother of these two. But here we have Mary, the of James and Joseph's mother. So these are like hyphenated adjectives that precede a word. And we can do that to some degree in English, but not enough that you could just bring this over left to right. So the diagrams help us to see that. So these are the two kids being described here. Just a note on Mary Magdalene, or Mary the Magdalene. This is from the UBS Translator's Handbook, which very helpfully says, this is a town near Tiberias on the west shore of the Lake of Galilee. The only thing the Gospels say about her is that she had 7 demons driven out of her by Jesus. There is nothing at all to support the past history commonly attributed to her. And if you have ever been at a checkout line in the grocery store, maybe you'll see sometimes they'll have those seasonal magazines. Probably we'll see them coming up for Easter. I've seen ones that are just Mary Magdalene. Who was she really? And there's a whole literature and lore about this. So I appreciate this, because it's not that we couldn't find out more about her from other historical sources. It's just that the Gospels give us this in Luke and only this, and Mark gives us only this about her. So that doesn't really affect translation per se, but given that she's such a prominent name, or a name that comes up, even in broader news stories from time to time, just interesting to note that about her. You could word search this too. I would maybe just take Magdalene, search for the lexeme. Here we've got, I'll just open up a parallel English text, Matthew 27. So this is the same thing. We're going to see her again in the resurrection in Matthew and in Mark. So she'll come up again, but that's it. I mean, she's only introduced here, and she's not even really introduced per se. I mean, there's just not much given about her. But here in Luke, we get some women who had been healed of evil spirits and disabilities. Mary called Magdalene. So there's that word, Luke 8:2. Looks like there was an error in the commentary. That should say Luke 8:2. So first time we meet her in Mark, same with these other women, and James the Younger, James the Smaller. Again, I think Mark probably is raising more questions for us than he's answering with this verse. To his first readers, listeners, presumably these would have been known. You can't do this for sure, but typically if a name is given without identifying information, it's because that name was known to the readers. And so I think that's probably the case here. And then here you just differentiate which Mary we're talking about. A translation decision to make here with James Hamikras, the younger, is this younger or smaller? And just a note here, there's different interpretation here, but I think James, the younger, kind of given in a family context, makes the most sense here. But that word mikras, and we'll look at it here in BDAG, can mean it can have to do with size, like stature, physical stature, but it can also have to do with age. All right, so again, more questions raised than answered here in translation. Not a whole lot of work to do in terms of understanding and contextualizing. Definitely some names to chase after here. Let me finish the sentence here, and then we'll leave the rest of the time for questions. So Mark's talking about these women. So we get the three named Hati en Hate en te Galilaya, ekoluthun auto, kai die kanun auto, kai alai palai haisunana basai auto es Hierosaluma. So now we do get a little bit of information about these three women, and that is that who, when they were in Galilee, were following him, Jesus. And this is from diakoneo. They were serving him, ministering to him, attending to him, supporting him. And many other who were following him from Jerusalem, or who were going with him, traveling with him from Jerusalem. Here's my translation. Who, when he was in Galilee, followed him and supported him. And there were many others who had traveled with him to Jerusalem. So about these three women, we get that when Jesus was in Galilee, they followed him and supported him. So that's not insignificant. And we may wonder, and it's just, I won't try to answer this, but we may wonder if they were following him and even supporting him, serving him, ministering to him, why is there not more? Which I think is a question that probably prompts such great interest in Mary Magdalene, for example, even on a broader cultural level. All right, but this is what Mark wants to tell us about about them. And there were many others who had traveled with him to Jerusalem. So this is a one long sentence that you could divide into smaller sentences. Admittedly, this is a little clunky if you read it all together, and I had to put the when he was in Galilee in dashes. There's no reason not to make this shorter sentences. We already have verbless clauses anyway, so we're already going to have to be doing some adjusting to get this to work in English. But I've just kept it here. It's all one sentence. I noted here we've got two imperfect verbs, ekoluthon and diakonun, both imperfect. I think two things. They're giving us background information because obviously we're not at the cross anymore. We're going back to when he was in Galilee. So imperfect verbs often will be used for background information. And I think they also probably carry the sense of ongoing acts. You know, this kolutheo is typically more than just you followed someone across the room one time and that's it. So that paired with the support or minister or serve gives us the sense of this was an ongoing thing, which again, just why don't we have more about them? I don't know. Diakonun is from diakoneo, serve, support, minister to. Max and Mary, from their grammatical analysis of the Greek New Testament, give us had been looking after. This could be worth looking at commentaries because for me it raises the question, you know, what exactly was this? I mean, this verb, this service or ministry can take different forms depending on, you know, what else is described in the situation. So I might just go to commentaries for that. You do need to decide eventually on a word. Do I choose ministered, supported, served, looked after? And I think searching this word across the Greek New Testament could help. What we would love, though, is if we had an example of these particular women doing that, but we don't. So it might be a little tough to know exactly what this means, but you may get somewhere with the word search and looking at your commentaries. Finally, and I'll stop with this, leave the rest of the time for questions. We have alai palai, many others who traveled with him to Jerusalem. Now, this is feminine plural, and in Greek, whereas a masculine plural, you think about Spanish or French the same way, a masculine plural could include men and women, or it could be only men. A feminine plural can only be all women. If you had one man and 99 women, you would still use the masculine plural. But the fact that we've got halai palai, that's feminine. So I did not bring that out in translation. I just said there were many others who had traveled with him to Jerusalem. But you may wish to, many other women. So the word women per se is not here, although you do have gunai case here for women. But that's just to explain why you might see that in other translations. So yes, the wording is saying many others, feminine plural. You can conclude that's many other women. So that would be one way to translate it. These women, as we will see, are being introduced here, and we'll see more about them later. I mean, Jesus has breathed his last at this point. So we are already starting to move. We get this, I mean, just a really significant 5 verses today where Jesus breathes his last, and then we have this powerful declaration, again, open to interpretation. And now we move to these women who are also watching from a distance. Well, they are like in the background to this story, but Mark's about to foreground them as we move into the resurrection account in just a little bit. Just to look ahead, we have the burial coming up, which takes us right back to these women, and then the resurrection. We have we have a contested ending to Mark, and then we have just a handful of verses from early on that we skipped before I realized we were going to do this whole book. So we'll circle back to that. We'll continue on more or less on a weekly basis, with a few exceptions here and there for travel and things like that. But let me just stop there and see what questions or comments you've got. I'm going to end the recording, and then I'll stay on for a moment and share a discount code with you. Yeah, here's a great comment. Let me put this in the chat. Somebody says, insightful comment in verse 41, how Jesus could live without a job. Many other women used to accompany and serve him, singular. Suppose the disciples needed to fend more for themselves. Yeah, and that's one way that I think historically this verse has been read, is that, yeah, where is the money for food coming from in all this? I mean, we think about Jesus in a tent making capacity as a carpenter, but there's no reference to carpentry jobs in the Gospels. So the general thinking has been he's not doing that anymore. I mean, he's a full-time itinerant preacher, no place to lay his head. So yeah, where is the money coming from? He doesn't maybe need a big salary, but he's got to find some way to get what he needs. And so, yeah, that's a great point, that this is one area that people will go and say, well, when it says support here, it has to do with financial support. And what I would do at the level of semantic range is I would just look at that word and make sure that there actually are uses of that where it means financial support. I don't think you're going to struggle to find that. But I would just look for that, because that would be interesting to see. Are there other times that word is used specifically and it's clear that it means financial support? But certainly that's been part of the interpretation here. I'm going to end the recording and stay on for just a moment. If you were watching on the recording, I'll just remind you, tinyurl.com/Mark Translation Notes has this handout and others. AbramKJ@AccordanceBible.com is how you can reach out to me.